Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk a little bit about the books that I'm reading this week. Two quick heads up in advance. Firstly, there's a dog with me who is now trying to come on and say hi because he's wondering why I'm just talking. He thinks it must be about him, surely, and it's almost dinner time. And secondly, there's a festival going on not far from where I'm staying. So apologies in advance if you can hear like a dum, dum, dum. That is not just like a washing machine or whatever in the background. That's a full-on festival. So there we go. Anyway, let's get talking a little bit about some of the books that I've been reading this week. First up is Jesmyn Ward's Let Us Descend. And I thought this was such a beautiful and creative piece of writing. It takes its sort of inspiration, essentially a young enslaved girl, and the ways that she and her family try to both escape and sort of then reconcile the sort of what's going on around them. But I think what sort of differentiates this from a sort of more typical, more sort of straight down the line sort of telling of a sort of slave narrative or kind of a story around slavery is just the sheer sort of poetry and almost kind of spirituality that kind of comes through the text. There are quite a few passages where she's talking about her mother, and her mother and her sort of other family members take on this sort of mythical quality. They almost appear like these sort of spirits or kind of guides. And there's a real sense in this book of this sort of sense of the ancestors passing on information. And so what kind of comes from that is just this really lyrical, beautiful piece of writing that really sort of blew me away. It's not something... I've read one other book by her, I think Sing Unburied Sing, and there's something to be said about the way that she really grapples with these huge topics, but introduces this real sort of, there's something magical about the way that it all threads together, and I think there's just something so special about that. Next up, I read Toward Eternity by Anton. His name you may better recognise as being a translator on many books, particularly Korean to English. And he has been incredibly prolific with translating Korean literature and helping it find a sort of home in the UK and sort of other English-speaking places. He's also just a very passionate sort of defender of translators and their rights and sort of their work conditions and all those kind of things. He's an all-round great guy. And it was really interesting to see what that then looks like from him as a novel, because, you know, I really appreciated his translations of other books, and it's been interesting to see a few other translators like Jennifer Croft, for example, also dip their feet into writing in their own language as well, or writing in Anton Her's case, writing in English, and sort of doing this interesting book that in many ways pulls on many of his experiences. So he grew up, I believe, kind of attending various sort of international schools or growing up with his very global education, I think in Thailand, Korea, parts of the US, moved around quite a bit. And this shows up in the book in quite a big way. This is a sort of sci-fi fantasy-esque book, but one that pulls on, in some ways it wears it quite lightly. The idea is that sort of looking at the human condition, which I realise sounds like such a general term for any novel, because most novels engage with the human condition in some capacity. But he looks at that particularly through the lens of things like translation and AI and all of that malarkey. So in the book, there are characters who become sort of clones of other characters, you know, and of other people. And sometimes you get this interesting moment when someone is, for example, the seventh clone, you know, a clone of a clone of a clone and blah, blah, blah. And what that then sort of brings up is this idea of memory and how elusive memory starts to become. Because, you know, if here's me, Bob, with my memories, a copy of Bob would have those same memories, but kind of almost from an academic sense of, you know, these are just things I know, and they're not necessarily memories I hold dear. And then a copy of that would sort of extenuate that even further. And I really loved this idea. I thought this was really fun, particularly how the book then plays with the idea of language. So it looks at, for example, so there's somebody at one point doing a PhD in poetry, and this is important in the book because the idea of poetry is sort of used as basically a stand-in for the human condition. So what's a thing that AI can't take away? It's the ability to appreciate something, to create poetry and things like that, but then to be able to feel it, to analyze it in a way that is sort of true to who you are, to kind of live poetry. And this becomes a kind of a constant topic throughout the book that I found really engaging. It's a book that I think just plays with this idea really beautifully of kind of what is left if everything is copied or is a copy of a copy. And I think it's just so beautifully done, and I really greatly enjoyed it. Next up, as part of my reading for the Polari Prize, I read Viola de Grado's Blue Hunger, which is a translation by Jamie Richards. And this is a wild ride of a book. I still don't fully know how to feel about it, but there's something about the sheer audacity of this book that I really greatly loved. So the core part of this is a relationship between an Italian woman and a Chinese woman. That in some ways is a very broad overview of this, because so much of what goes on is almost fantastical, but there are these elements where we sort of have different timelines. What have I done with my hair? These different sort of timelines where we flash back occasionally, look at different moments, but particularly is the idea that these two women have grown apart and have separated in some capacity, and there's a lot of sort of tension and almost disagreement about how it came to end. But then when they are together, there's this real intensity to their passion that is both entirely very sexual, but also kind of almost violent, and there's a kind of almost hunger to it, hence the title of the book, perhaps. And this is sort of mirrored in the chapter titles, which seem to be parts of the body, but in a very clinical sense of almost something like a pig. You know, we get things like cutlets, for example, or we get, you know, these sort of parts of an animal that is more about kind of dissecting it and cooking it. And I just thought it was such a bold, but I see why it was chosen for the Polari long list, because I think it's so distinctive and does something really daring, I think, with how it presents love and passion and all of these sorts of things in this very sort of psychosexual kind of way. Yeah, really interesting book. Very, very wild, but really interesting. Next up, I read a few little short books. A lot of these actually are relatively short. I'm, as I mentioned, away with a dog, and I've sort of brought some books with me. So there'll be a bit of a range. I'll get a bit more onto booker territory probably next week when I sit down and really give them dedicated time. But here are some other books that aren't that. So firstly, starting off with a book that I've been intending to read for a while, and the New York Times list of 100 books really sort of poked this further up for me. And that is Citizen, an American, oh, it's really shiny. Citizen, an American Lyric by Claudia Rankine. And this is really quite staggering, I think. It's a book that is sort of non-fiction, but kind of told in this slightly, it's sort of like a personal essay almost, and it almost has a sort of poetic quality to it. But she analyses various, particularly Black figures in the US, and kind of the ways that their bodies and identities and lives are politicized in various ways. So an early example of this is Serena Williams. She talks about how Serena Williams's anger is perceived in certain ways compared to some of her compatriots and other sort of fellow tennis colleagues, and the ways that, particularly when she's playing against a white player, there is a way that their bodies are often contrasted, or their kind of temperaments are contrasted, that seems to speak to something like this, that there's a kind of, you know, the trope of the angry Black woman, for example, or vice versa, or several other things. But apart from that, she also looks at various football players, she looks at sort of political figures, and there's something about the breadth of this in relatively short amount of, it's like 150 pages, and many of those pages are, you know, sort of short on text. There's something really impressive about the way that so I'll hold it a bit closer. There we go. There's something really impressive about the way that she manages to distill so many of these big political moments and big conversations and discussions into such a small amount of space, and particularly going into the kind of the personal and the political and kind of how they overlap. So I think this is just, I totally see why this is on the list. I think it's an incredible book, really clever in its perception, I think, and really sort of probing. That's the word I'm looking for. It sort of pulls out these examples and allows you to kind of sit with the kind of discomfort of that, which I think is really impressive. Next up, a particularly wild, God, the lighting, what is that doing? Spent Light by Lara Pawson. And this is a wild ride. It reads almost like a fever dream at times because it changes so often paragraph to paragraph or even mid-sentence for what you're talking about. And actually it really works, I think, because of that. So the idea is there's a woman who basically starts to analyze almost the kitchen object, the objects in her kitchen and then in her wider house. And it starts with the toaster and it goes into all these other, or is it kettle? Goes into all these other areas. And those other areas that she goes into include, but not include, but are not limited to, African history, the state of the world in general, politics, Brexit, the rights of women. Like, she just goes off on these incredible tangents, but there's something about it that feels utterly connected. So at first, when you start reading it, you're like, where on earth is this narrative going? Because it's written sort of as a novel, but it sort of reads almost non-fiction at times. It reads like a sort of personal essay. And it kind of straddles the line between the two of them. But this is a character who's been created, so it sort of reads as fiction in that respect. But this character just sort of darts between these thoughts. And yeah, like I said, when she starts the book, you just think this is so entirely disconnected. But it kind of builds into a rhythm of its own, where it suggests something, like, for example, Angolan politics, which Lara Pawson's written about before. And then 20 pages later, something else will come up that references Angola or will reference corruption in Africa or something else. And there's something about the way she threads that through that's fascinating, and including, for example, something about, at one point, she talks about her phone, and she starts analysing her phone and thinking about it, and then she starts thinking about cobalt, the metal, and then or mineral, whatever it is. And then she starts thinking about about the Congo. And then she starts thinking about how she's holding in her hand a phone where large parts of it have come from Africa, and it therefore is an African creation, but also not. And she just sort of goes off these tangents. You're like, where on earth is this going? But it's still utterly compelling. I think just kind of go along for the ride. It's a short book. I'd almost recommend just diving headfirst and just letting it all wash over you in one or two sittings, because I just think it's a really fun ride. Yeah, utterly bizarre but wonderful book, I think. And last but not least, a book I've been meaning to read forever, and I've had a copy for a couple of years now as well, but just haven't managed to get round to, The Normal Heart by Larry Kramer. And so Larry Kramer was an activist, particularly around HIV and AIDS in the early days, particularly in the US. And so he saw the kind of early crest of this. And he is quite a divisive figure. He was sort of right up at the front telling people to act really quickly. And in many ways, he mobilized a lot of funds and attention and activity behind HIV/AIDS work early on, and particularly when very little was known. As comes up in this play, a lot of what is covered is in that period where it still wasn't isolated as a virus. That people just knew that people were dying. And so Larry Kramer is this sort of agitator who in many ways also agitated a lot of people. He was quite divisive because of that, because he was very strident, and in many ways pushed a lot of things forward, but also lost a lot of friends and made a lot of enemies in the process. Some would say for the better, some would say for the worse. And in this play, he was basically seeking to sort of double down on his message. And so there is a stand-in almost for him in the play, a man called Ned Weeks, who is a man who basically sees the crisis coming, wants to tell everybody about it, and is generally disliked by a fair few people and kicked out of organizations they founded, like Larry Kramer. It's very clearly a stand-in. And the book is also, the play is also controversial because there are some figures who appear in this book where friends of his afterwards, or former friends, would say, oh, I think that's meant to be me. But anyway, so The Normal Heart is a play that kind of investigates that early moment particularly, and watches as people start to die from the early stages of HIV and AIDS. So obviously incredibly difficult to read at times, but it also goes into some of the sort of bigger conversations within this about, you know, what is the correct course of action? Is it for nobody to have sex? Is it for safer sex messaging? How do you get this out here? How do you convince people? And, you know, parallels with something like with coronavirus, in the sense of sort of those early stages where nobody really knows anything. So everyone kind of picks a side or picks a thing that they're doing quite quickly and works out whether that's the best course of action. You know, people either stay indoors and hide away, or people carry on as normal. You know, all these sorts of things happen, and the play kind of investigates that side of human psychology around things like this. And there's a nurse character, I think Emma, I think her name is, and she is sort of there as the kind of professional who is just watching as all of these things are happening and seeing how, for example, funding is not being provided, or funding's being channeled into a way that she's particularly skeptical of, because she thinks that it's stopping knowledge sharing and is just so that somebody can win a Nobel Prize instead of actually solving the problem. And so all of these things that come into it. And it's sort of a bit of a classic in the kind of queer lit canon, even if he himself was a complex figure, but I think it still is an incredibly important book to read. And there's a letter in here from 2011, I think it is, where he's writing to audience, it's given out to audiences seeing the play, saying, hey, look, the fight is still far from over. And it's really interesting to see that in a kind of wider context of where we are now as well. So those are some of the books that I read this week. I hope you are having a really lovely week. The dog has somehow managed to sleep through the entirety of this video, and I was very convinced that he would start sort of jumping on me. So thank goodness that hasn't happened. He's lovely. If I remember, I'll put a little picture here so you can see him. He's gorgeous. He's a little lab. But yes, have a wonderful week. I hope you're keeping really well, and take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.